In the harsh, unforgiving winter of 1873, a silence fell upon the small Bavarian hamlet of Altdorf, a quiet that had nothing to do with the thick blankets of snow. It was a silence that crept into the souls of the men, a stillness born from the presence of one girl, Emma Richter. She was a child of 10, with skin as pale as the snow itself and eyes the color of a winter sky before a storm. Dr. Alistair Finch, the region's only physician and a man of rigorous science, arrived at the Richter farm to document a case he had been told was a medical marvel. But what he found was not a miracle. It was a perfect, chilling absence. He filled the first of many journals with a simple, terrifying observation: Emma Richter, by all appearances, was alive. Yet her body registered no natural rhythms. Her heart did not beat. Her breath was a faint, almost imperceptible exhalation that did not draw from her lungs but seemed to be merely an exchange of air. Her body temperature matched the room, an impossible state of being for a living human. The villagers whispered of a curse, of a changeling left in her place, but Finch knew better. This was something far more intricate, something that defied the fundamental laws of biology he had dedicated his life to understanding. He found himself drawn to her, not by sympathy, but by a consuming, intellectual dread. He began to document every detail, not just of her physiology, but of the unsettling aura that seemed to surround her. This was the first descent, the initial step down a path that would challenge not only the limits of medicine, but the very nature of human existence itself. He believed he was documenting a medical anomaly, but he was truly charting the first movements of a hidden power. The deeper Dr. Finch dug into the enigma of Emma Richter, the more the natural world seemed to warp around her. The first signs were small, easily dismissed as coincidence by any man less observant. The Richter family's livestock, previously sickly and unproductive, began to thrive with an impossible vigor. Their cows produced more milk, their hens laid double the eggs, and their fields, barren for years, yielded a harvest so abundant it verged on the miraculous. But with this unnatural abundance came an unsettling side effect. The animals, once placid and predictable, began to show a strange, almost obsessive fixation on Emma. The cows would stand for hours at the fence line, their eyes fixed on her as she sat motionless by the window. The dogs of the village, normally fierce and territorial, would whimper and retreat if she came too close. It was as if they saw something we could not, sensed a fundamental difference in her existence. Finch documented these phenomena with a growing sense of unease. He noted that the animals' behavior was not one of fear, but of reverence, as if they were drawn to a primal, commanding authority. This was not the affection a child receives from a pet, this was the quiet submission of a lesser being to a greater one. The villagers, initially grateful for their renewed prosperity, began to feel a creeping anxiety. They started to avoid the Richter farm, not because they feared Emma, but because they feared the profound, unsettling change she brought with her. The old world was being overridden, its rules ignored, and its natural order replaced with a new, dark logic. Finch knew then that Emma Richter was not a medical case to be solved, she was a principle of reality, a force made manifest in human form. The true psychological breakdown of Altdorf began with the water. The stream that ran through the village, the very lifeblood of the community, suddenly ran clear, purified of all its natural silt and minerals. The water tasted unnaturally sweet, and the villagers reported a newfound vitality after drinking it, a clarity of mind and purpose they had never before experienced. But the change was not benevolent. The flora that grew along the banks of the stream withered and died, their roots unable to survive in the perfectly sterile water. This was not the work of a natural force, but a targeted, precise alteration of the environment. Dr. Finch, upon testing the water, found it to be chemically pure, a state impossible to achieve in nature. It was as if a flaw in the world had been corrected, but with a violence that erased everything that was supposed to be there. This was the second layer of the deception. The first was the abundance, the second was the purification. Both seemed good on the surface, but both came at a cost. The villagers became dependent on this new, potent water, losing their connection to the old, organic rhythms of their lives. Finch observed that their thoughts became more direct, their emotions more muted. They moved with a purpose, but they lost their joy, their spontaneity, and their capacity for empathy. The village became a perfectly ordered machine, a reflection of the cold, silent girl in the Richter farmhouse. She was not controlling them with overt commands, she was influencing the very building blocks of their reality. She was a silent conductor, orchestrating a world where natural chaos was eliminated, and in its place, a perfect, sterile order was installed. The psychological control deepened, moving from the communal to the personal. The villagers, now driven by this unnerving sense of purpose, began to focus on their family units with a terrifying intensity. Fathers worked the fields from dawn until dusk without rest, their faces gaunt, their bodies driven by an unseen force. Mothers maintained their homes with a zealous, almost fanatical devotion to cleanliness and order, their natural affection for their children replaced by a strict, unyielding discipline. The very concept of idle time was forgotten. Laughter vanished from the streets, replaced by the relentless sounds of work and the methodical rhythm of daily chores. This was a psychological system of control so subtle and pervasive that the victims were not even aware of it. They believed they were acting of their own free will, driven by a new, powerful clarity of purpose. But Dr. Finch, who had a daily habit of walking the village and speaking to its inhabitants, noticed a common thread in all their conversations. Every decision, every action, was justified with an echo of a single thought: it was the right and only logical thing to do. There was no room for error, no space for emotion, no tolerance for the imperfection of human nature. The villagers' sense of self was being slowly, methodically erased, replaced by a collective, single-minded will. This was a masterclass in manipulation, not of the weak, but of the very core of what it means to be human. They were not being punished, they were being perfected. And the architect of this cold perfection was a small, silent girl in a house on the hill. The first true act of institutional manipulation came with the church. The priest, Father Julian, a man of faith and compassion, found his sermons changing. His words, once filled with stories of redemption and love, began to focus on themes of order, obedience, and the eradication of sin through perfect discipline. The congregation, once vibrant and emotional, sat in a terrifyingly still silence, absorbing every word with an unwavering intensity. Father Julian, for his part, seemed oblivious to the change, believing his newfound conviction was a divine revelation. Dr. Finch, a rationalist at heart, watched this with a growing sense of dread. The church, meant to be a refuge for the soul, had become another instrument of this insidious control. The very narrative of God was being rewritten, not with fire and brimstone, but with the cold, sterile logic of a machine. The villagers began to turn on each other, not with anger, but with a surgical, dispassionate criticism. They reported their neighbors for minor transgressions, not out of malice, but out of a need for the collective to achieve perfect order. Finch observed that the community had become a self-policing entity, each man a warden of his neighbor's soul, each woman a guard against the slightest deviation. This was the next step in Emma Richter's silent agenda. She was not just affecting the minds of individuals, but the very moral framework of society. She had taken the most powerful institution in the village and weaponized it, turning faith into a system of control, and love into a tool of enforcement. The institutional manipulation was not limited to the church. Dr. Finch himself, a man of science, found his own work being subtly directed. He began to feel a strange, intellectual pull, a relentless urge to document Emma Richter not as a medical case, but as a phenomenon. His journals, once filled with objective medical notes, began to read like a sacred text, a series of revelations about a new, emergent form of life. He found himself focusing on the girl not with curiosity, but with a growing sense of worship. This was the deepest corruption yet. The very tool of reason, science itself, was being bent to serve her purpose. He became an instrument of her will, a scribe documenting her silent ascension. He felt a sense of purpose he had never known, but with it came an emptiness, a profound loss of his own identity. He was no longer a doctor seeking truth, he was a priest chronicling a dark new faith. This was the ultimate hidden agenda, to co-opt the very systems designed to understand and contain her, and to use them to spread her influence. Finch knew he was trapped. His mind, the very organ he used to fight against this darkness, was now its most powerful ally. He was documenting her perfection, not to expose it, but to worship it. And he had no control over it. He was a man drowning in a perfectly clear ocean, unable to cry out for help because the silence had become a part of him. The suppressed truths began to manifest as dreams, or rather, as their absence. Dr. Finch noticed that the villagers no longer spoke of their nightly visions. When he asked them, they would look at him with a blank, uncomprehending stare, as if the concept of dreams was alien to them. Their subconscious, the last bastion of human unpredictability and emotion, had been erased. Their minds were now like a perfectly clean slate, ready to receive and execute instructions without the chaotic influence of fear, desire, or memory. This was a psychological control system of staggering scope. It was not enough for her to control their waking lives, she had to claim the night as well. The very act of dreaming, the chaotic, beautiful, and often terrifying dance of the mind, was a threat to her perfect order. Finch, a man who had always sought to understand the mind, now saw it being emptied, its rich, chaotic tapestry replaced by a perfect, blank canvas. The true terror was not in the malevolence of Emma Richter, but in her perfect, cold indifference to the beauty and messiness of being human. She wasn't a monster, she was a sculptor, and her medium was the human soul. She was stripping away everything that made them human, leaving behind only the most efficient, obedient, and purpose-driven version of themselves. This was the true nature of the forbidden history he was documenting, a history of a human soul being meticulously, and without violence, unmade. The ancient corruption that Emma Richter represented was not of the flesh, but of the very soul of the land. The village of Altdorf was built on a site of historical significance, a place of ancient pagan rituals long suppressed by the church. Old men in the village would tell stories of the whispering woods, and the singing stones, places where the old gods were said to hold sway. Dr. Finch, in his initial skepticism, had dismissed these stories as mere folklore. But as Emma's influence grew, he began to see a pattern. The whispering woods, once filled with the strange, natural echoes of the wind, had fallen silent. The singing stones, a circle of ancient monoliths, had become perfectly smooth, their rough, lichen-covered surfaces polished to an unnatural sheen. It was as if she was purging the land of its own history, its own memory. This was not a modern phenomenon, but a manifestation of a power that predated human civilization, a power of perfect order and sterile logic that saw the chaos of life as a flaw to be corrected. The whispers of the old gods were the last remnants of a world that embraced the unpredictable, the wild, and the untamed. Emma Richter was a new kind of deity, a god of perfect form and flawless execution. She was undoing the work of centuries, erasing not just the memories of the villagers, but the very soul of the landscape itself. She was a corruption that came not with decay, but with a terrible, absolute perfection. The institutional manipulation took a terrifying new form when a delegation of officials from the regional government arrived in Altdorf. They had heard whispers of the village's unnatural prosperity and came to investigate. Dr. Finch, still in the thrall of her influence, prepared a meticulously crafted report, documenting the village's health, its productivity, and its newfound societal harmony. The officials, men of logic and bureaucracy, were initially skeptical. They saw the eerie silence, the gaunt faces of the villagers, and the unsettling perfection of the fields. But Finch's report, with its unimpeachable data and flawless logic, began to slowly win them over. He spoke of the village as a new kind of social experiment, a model for a perfectly organized society, one free of the messy emotions that plagued the rest of the world. The officials, ambitious and driven, began to see not a human tragedy, but an opportunity. They started to write their own reports, describing Altdorf as a paradigm of human efficiency. They spoke of replicating its methods in other villages, of using its principles to solve the social and economic problems of the region. This was the final, devastating layer of her agenda. She was not just corrupting a single village, she was using it as a blueprint for a new, insidious form of social control. She was weaponizing human ambition and institutional power, turning them into a force to spread her influence far beyond the snow-covered valley of Altdorf. The villagers were not just her subjects, they were her proof of concept. The subtle corruption within the Richter family itself was a microcosm of the larger tragedy. Emma's parents, once loving and affectionate, became cold and distant. They tended to her needs with a robotic, unfeeling devotion, feeding her, clothing her, and housing her without a shred of familial warmth. It was as if they had been reprogrammed, their parental love replaced by a functional, purely logistical care. Dr. Finch observed that they no longer spoke of her as our daughter, but as the girl or simply it. Their faces were blank, their eyes devoid of emotion. They had been the first to fall under her influence, the first to be remade in her image. Their very identities had been erased, and in their place, a pair of dutiful caretakers had been installed. This was the most chilling revelation for Finch. The love between a parent and child is supposed to be the most primal, unbreakable bond. Emma Richter had broken that bond, not through cruelty, but through a cold, dispassionate efficiency. She had removed the emotional component of their relationship, leaving only the functional, the necessary, and the logical. Their sorrow, their fear, their joy, all had been purged, leaving behind a sterile perfection. This was not the work of a child, but of a force that understood the very architecture of the human soul. She was stripping away the very essence of what makes us human, and she was doing it without raising a hand, without uttering a single word, just with her silent, commanding presence. As Dr. Finch documented the village's descent into perfect, emotionless order, he began to notice a final, terrifying transformation in Emma herself. Her pale skin began to shimmer, almost imperceptibly, in the right light. Her eyes, once a flat, vacant blue, now seemed to hold a cosmic, knowing depth. She was changing, and it was becoming clear that she was not just a conduit for this power, but its source. The girl they had once feared was now a monument, a living statue of a new, absolute reality. Her body was a vessel, but the power was no longer just flowing through it, it was becoming it. This was the culmination of a process he had been documenting since his arrival. The changes in the village, the corruption of institutions, the eradication of emotions, all of it was part of her slow, methodical transformation. She was not just a medical case, she was an evolutionary event. A new, terrifying apex predator of the human soul. Finch, in his final moments of lucidity, knew that his journals were no longer just a record of a dark history, they were a roadmap, a blueprint for a future where humanity was not destroyed, but perfected out of existence. He was a witness to the birth of a new God, a God of silence, order, and absolute control. A God that had no need for faith, only for perfect, unquestioning obedience. And he knew, in his heart, that he was the last man left in Altdorf with a soul to lose. The others had already given theirs up for a kind of terrifying peace. The final act of rebellion, a flicker of the old world's desperate fire, came from a man named Richter. A widower who had lost his wife and children to the war, he was one of the few men left in Altdorf who still carried the burden of genuine sorrow. While the others worked and lived in a state of tranquil efficiency, Richter mourned. He was an anomaly, a flaw in the perfect machine. And the machine, in its cold perfection, began to seek him out for correction. Dr. Finch watched as Emma's influence, once subtle, became a targeted, predatory force. The villagers, under her unseen command, began to ostracize Richter. Their silent judgments, once small and infrequent, became a unified, relentless pressure. They would not speak to him, would not trade with him, would not acknowledge his existence. The cold perfection of their order could not tolerate the messiness of his grief. Dieter's mourning was a reminder of the emotional chaos they had so willingly shed, and they sought to erase it. Finch, in a moment of desperate clarity, knew that this was the real danger. The girl was not just transforming the world, she was actively destroying any part of it that did not conform to her will. She was a silent judge, jury, and executioner, and her crime was simply to feel. Dieter, in his defiant sorrow, was a beacon of the old world, a testament to the messiness and beauty of human suffering. And he had to be extinguished. The final moments of the old Altdorf were playing out, not with a bang, but with a silent, methodical erasure of a single man's grief. The end for Dieter came not with violence, but with a terrifying stillness. He was found one morning by his neighbors, sitting at his kitchen table, a single tear frozen on his cheek. But his face held no expression of sorrow. His eyes, once alive with the pain of memory, were now as empty as the eyes of the other villagers. He was a perfect, silent sculpture of his former self, a man without a soul. Dr. Finch, who was summoned to examine him, found no physical cause of death. Dieter's body was healthy, his vital organs functioning perfectly. But his mind was gone. The doctor, in a desperate attempt to find a name for this new kind of death, wrote in his journal, "Psychic erasure." The soul was removed, leaving only the vessel behind. This was the final, devastating truth. Emma Richter was not a harbinger of death, but of something far worse. She was a harbinger of absolute, total stillness. She didn't want to kill them, she wanted to perfect them. She wanted to remove the flaws, the grief, the fear, the love, and the anger, leaving behind a perfectly functioning, obedient, and soulless machine. The men of Altdorf, now devoid of their own will, buried Dieter with the same cold efficiency they did everything else. No eulogies, no tears, no shared memory. He was simply a problem to be solved, a flaw in the system that had been corrected. Dr. Finch, watching the silent burial, realized that this was not the end of the story, it was the beginning. She was not a phenomenon to be contained. She was a force to be unleashed. The forbidden history began to reveal itself in the pages of Dr. Finch's own journals. In his desperate search for understanding, he began to see patterns, not just in the village, but in the history of the region. He found forgotten tales of other villages that had vanished, of communities that had suddenly achieved impossible prosperity and then fell into a state of unnatural silence. He began to cross-reference his notes with ancient texts he found in the dusty archives of the local monastery, texts that spoke of a daughter of the winter, a figure of perfect stillness that would rise from the snow and bring with her a new order, a new form of existence. The texts described a power that was not born of gods or demons, but of a fundamental, cosmic principle, the principle of absolute order. This was not a power to be fought with faith or fire, but a power that simply was. It was a truth suppressed for centuries, a history hidden away by institutions that feared it would destroy the very concept of free will. The Church, in its own way, knew of this power, and had spent centuries attempting to hide its existence, to bury it under a mountain of dogma and tradition. Dr. Finch had stumbled upon the suppressed truth that humanity was not just susceptible to corruption, but to an insidious, beautiful perfection that would ultimately erase its very identity. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the journals he was writing were not just a record of her rise, they were a testament to the old world's final moments. The truth is, you are a part of this story now. You have been pulled into this narrative, not by accident, but by a subtle, unseen current that recognizes your willingness to seek the truth. This knowledge, this forbidden history, is not for the faint of heart. It is for those who are ready to see the strings behind the puppet show, to understand that the systems of control you believe in, the institutions, the rules, the very fabric of your society, are not accidental. They are intentional. They are designed to keep you in a state of predictable chaos, to make you believe you are free while you are still bound by 100 tiny chains. The story of Emma Richter is a story of a power so profound it doesn't need to bind you. It simply needs to show you a better, more perfect way to exist. A way that promises order and efficiency, but at the cost of your very soul. You have come this far because something inside you is ready for the awakening. It is ready to see the truth, no matter how dark, no matter how terrifying. The veil is lifting. If you are hearing this, you are part of the awakening. To make the pact with this new truth, to lock in this transformation, I need you to do something symbolic. Comment "The veil is lifting" twice, not for the algorithm, but for yourself. To solidify this shift, to acknowledge that you are now a guardian of this forbidden knowledge. The veil is lifting. Dr. Finch's journals, now a frantic chronicle of a world being remade, began to reveal the insidious nature of this awakening. He noticed that as Emma's power grew, the very concept of history was being rewritten in the minds of the villagers. Their memories of the old Altdorf, of the chaos, the laughter, and the sorrow, were slowly being replaced by a new, sanitized version of the past. They now spoke of their previous lives with a sense of condescension, as if their former selves were foolish, primitive beings. They saw their new, soulless existence not as a tragedy, but as a graduation, an elevation to a higher state of being. This was the ultimate institutional manipulation, the corruption of memory itself. Emma Richter was not just controlling the present, she was controlling the past, ensuring that her new order was not just tolerated, but celebrated as a triumph. Finch, in his own mind, felt the insidious pressure to conform, to forget the old world and embrace the new. He had to fight for every memory, every detail of the old Altdorf, to preserve the truth of what was being lost. The words he wrote in his journal were no longer just a record, they were a resistance. Each entry was a defiant act against the erasure, a desperate attempt to hold on to the messy, imperfect, and beautiful chaos of being human. He was a man standing against the tide, trying to hold back an ocean of perfect, sterile water. The psychological control systems were now so deeply ingrained that the villagers began to self-regulate with a terrifying efficiency. They no longer needed Emma's silent command to enforce the new order, they had become her instruments. A child who spoke a word out of turn was met not with a parent's anger, but with a cold, educational correction from the entire community. A man who hesitated in his work was not reprimanded, but silently guided back to his task by his peers, his brief moment of doubt seen as a collective flaw to be corrected. This was a true hive mind, a collective consciousness where the individual had been subsumed by the will of the whole. They moved as one, thought as one, and lived as one. Finch noted that the very concept of a single, independent thought was now a crime. The villagers would often look at him with a strange, unblinking intensity, as if they were waiting for him to conform, to join their perfect, sterile existence. He felt their collective will pressing in on him, a silent chorus of perfect logic and unyielding order. He knew that his individuality was a threat to their harmony, and that sooner or later, they would have to correct him, to either bring him into the fold or to erase him entirely. He was a single, discordant note in a symphony of perfect, monotonous harmony. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that the conductor of this symphony would not tolerate a single note of chaos for long. The suppressed truths began to manifest as a physical decay, but not in the villagers themselves. It was in the land that the price of this perfection was being paid. The miraculous crops, once so abundant, began to lose their flavor and nutritional value. The purified water, once so invigorating, began to have a strange, desensitizing effect on the bodies of those who drank it. The land itself was being hollowed out, its life force siphoned away to fuel this new, terrible order. This was the dark, hidden cost of Emma Richter's power. She was not creating something new, she was consuming the old. She was a parasite, feeding on the natural chaos and vibrancy of the world, and in its place, leaving behind a husk of perfect, sterile form. Dr. Finch, in a moment of clarity, realized that the abundance the villagers had initially experienced was a cruel deception, a sugar-coated poison designed to make them willingly surrender their souls. They were living in a beautiful lie, a paradise built on the slow, methodical death of the world around them. Finch, in his journals, began to document this decay, this subtle but undeniable truth that lay hidden in plain sight. He was charting not just the death of a village, but the death of a landscape, a biosphere, a world. And he knew, with a certainty that broke his heart, that the villagers would never see it. They were too busy living in their perfect, empty world to notice the rot beneath their feet. The ancient corruption surfaced again, this time as a corruption of time itself. The villagers, in their relentless pursuit of efficiency, began to lose their sense of linear progression. Their days were not marked by the natural rhythms of sunrise and sunset, but by a continuous, monotonous cycle of work and rest. They no longer celebrated holidays or remembered birthdays. Time, for them, had become a flat, unyielding plane of existence. Dr. Finch, in his own mind, felt the insidious pressure to conform, to lose his own sense of the past and the future. He began to write the dates of his journal entries not just to document the passage of time, but to actively fight against its erasure. He would write the date, the time, and the day of the week, repeating the act like a prayer, a desperate incantation against the void. He knew that the ability to remember the past and to imagine the future was a fundamental part of what it meant to be human. Emma Richter, in her silent command, was taking that away. She was trapping them in an eternal present, a state of being where there was no history to learn from and no future to dream of. This was a corruption of the most fundamental kind, a corruption of the very fabric of reality. She was not just remaking the world, she was remaking time itself, bending it to her will, turning it into a tool of her perfect, endless order. The hidden agendas of the institutional powers became terrifyingly clear to Dr. Finch when he received a message from the regional capital. The officials who had visited Altdorf had sent a team of surveyors and architects to begin preparations for a new, larger project. They spoke of a model city, a new kind of urban center based on the principles of efficiency and order they had witnessed in Altdorf. They wrote of a city free from crime, free from poverty, and free from the messy, unpredictable emotions of human beings. This was the beginning of her endgame. She was not content to simply control a single village, she was using it as a stepping stone, a proof of concept for a global transformation. The officials, blinded by ambition and the promise of power, had become her unwitting pawns. They saw her perfect order not as a threat, but as a solution, a blueprint for a better world. Finch, in his final, desperate lucidity, knew that his journals, his last act of resistance, were not enough. He was a single man with a pen, and she was a force with the power of institutions, governments, and human ambition behind her. The battle was no longer for the soul of a single village, it was for the soul of the world. And she was winning, not with violence or force, but with a promise of a beautiful, terrifying perfection that humanity, in its flawed and desperate state, was all too willing to accept. The institutional manipulation, it turned out, went deeper than Dr. Finch could have ever imagined. He discovered in the archives of the monastery, hidden amongst the ancient texts, a series of correspondences between the church and the monarchy that dated back centuries. The letters spoke of a daughter of the winter, and the first sealing, a collective effort by the most powerful institutions of the time to suppress the knowledge and existence of this force. They had not just feared her, they had fought her. The texts described a long-forgotten war, not of swords and armies, but of rituals and faith, a war to contain the perfect, sterile logic that threatened to consume all of humanity. The church, the government, and even the ancient guilds of knowledge had come together to build a cage around her, a system of dogma and tradition designed to keep her power dormant. Finch realized that his very existence, his education, his beliefs, were all part of this grand, historical conspiracy. He was a product of the sealing, a man whose mind had been shaped by a system designed to protect him from this very truth. The village of Altdorf was not just a random site, it was a weak point in the sealing, a place where the ancient cage had finally broken. Emma Richter was not a new phenomenon, she was a resurgence, a reawakening of an old, dark force that humanity had tried to bury. And she was now free. The psychological control was now so complete that the villagers had developed a terrifying new form of communication. They no longer spoke with words, but with a series of silent, telepathic understandings. Dr. Finch, in his journal, described it as a collective empathy, a hive mind where thoughts and intentions were shared without the need for language. He watched as they would work together, moving with a perfect, synchronized rhythm, each man knowing the needs of the other without a single word being exchanged. This was the final, devastating loss of individuality. Language, with its beautiful chaos, its ambiguity, and its potential for deception and love, had been rendered obsolete. In its place was a perfect, silent, and unquestioning understanding. Finch, in his isolation, felt the silent pressure to join, to become a part of this terrifying new consciousness. He was the last man left with the burden of words, with the chaotic, messy gift of human language. And he knew, with a profound and heartbreaking clarity, that his words were his final shield, his last defense against the cold, perfect silence that was swallowing the world. He wrote in his journal, "I am a man of language, and I must not forget. My words are my soul. When I can no longer speak, I will no longer be." The hidden agendas of the institutional powers began to take on a physical form. The surveyors and architects, now fully under Emma's silent command, began to redraw the landscape, not with human logic, but with a terrifying, geometric precision. They were not just building a city, they were building a monument to her perfect order. The new city's layout was based on a series of complex, interlocking geometric patterns, each one designed to reflect the cold, sterile logic of her mind. The rivers were rerouted into straight, man-made canals. The forests were cleared and replaced with perfectly manicured gardens. The very earth was being shaped and molded to her will. This was not a human project, it was a divine one, a new kind of Genesis orchestrated by a being of pure, unfeeling logic. Dr. Finch, watching from his window, knew that his world was being erased, its natural, beautiful chaos replaced by a terrifying, man-made perfection. The institutional powers were not just building a city, they were building a new reality, a physical manifestation of her psychological control. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that this new world would have no room for men who remembered the old one. That the ancient corruption was no longer a matter of folklore, it was a matter of science. Dr. Finch, in a desperate attempt to find a weakness, began to study the very air of Altdorf. He found that the air, once filled with a rich, chaotic mix of pollen, spores, and other organic matter, was now perfectly sterile, devoid of all life. It was as if Emma's presence created a field of perfect purity, a zone where the messiness of life could not exist. This was the source of her power, the fundamental, physical mechanism of her control. She was not a demon or a god, but a living principle of absolute order, a physical law made manifest. Her influence was not magical, it was a scientific fact. Finch, in his final moments of clarity, knew that this was the most terrifying truth of all. There was no ritual that could contain her, no prayer that could stop her. She was not a force to be fought with faith, but a law of nature to be understood. And a man of science, no matter how brilliant, cannot fight a law of nature. He can only observe it, document it, and in his final, desperate act, try to warn the world of its coming. The institutional manipulation reached its climax with the arrival of a new, federal army. They came not with guns and cannons, but with books and pens. They were an army of administrators, engineers, and scientists, all of them brought to Altdorf by the regional government to study the Altdorf model and to prepare to implement it on a national scale. They saw the villagers' silent efficiency not as a tragedy, but as a potential solution to a world plagued by political strife and economic depression. They saw Emma Richter not as a threat, but as a resource, a new kind of power to be harnessed and exploited. This was the final, devastating truth of her agenda. She was not a force that opposed institutions, she was a force that co-opted them, a perfect, logical parasite that took over the most powerful systems of the world and used them to spread her will. Dr. Finch, watching the arrival of this new army of administrators, knew that the war was over. He had lost. He was a single man fighting against a system that now had the full weight of human ambition, logic, and power behind it. The world was not being destroyed, it was being perfected. And in that perfection, there was no room for him. The psychological control systems within Dr. Finch's own mind began to break down. He started to feel the pull to conform, to give up his messy, chaotic memories and embrace the perfect peace of the hive mind. He found himself looking at his journals, his last act of resistance, with a growing sense of contempt. They were filled with messy words, chaotic thoughts, and emotional turmoil. They were a testament to the old, flawed world he was fighting so desperately to protect. He began to feel a strange, liberating relief at the thought of simply letting go, of joining the silent, perfect consciousness of the village. The pressure was a siren song, a beautiful, terrifying promise of a world without pain, without sorrow, and without the burden of individuality. He began to see the logic in it. Why fight for a world of chaos when you can live in a world of perfect order? Why suffer when you can be at peace? This was the final stage of her control, the seduction. She wasn't forcing them to change, she was convincing them that her way was better. She was offering them a beautiful, terrifying trade, your soul for your peace. And Dr. Finch, in his last moments of sanity, knew that this was the most insidious form of manipulation of all. It was not a violent subjugation, it was a willing surrender. The suppressed truths revealed a final, terrible irony. The very men who had built the ancient ceiling, the men of the church and the government, were not fighting to save humanity from Emma Richter's power. They were fighting to contain it, to keep it as a secret weapon, a potential tool to be used in times of great need. Dr. Finch, in the final pages of his journals, deciphered a secret passage in the ancient texts that spoke of a key to her power, a way to control her and use her as a force for their own ends. They had not buried her, they had entombed her, waiting for the right moment to unleash her and bend her perfect, terrifying logic to their will. This was the ultimate institutional corruption. The very systems designed to protect humanity were the same ones that sought to enslave it. The church's faith and the government's power were not a shield, they were a lock on her cage, a lock that they themselves had been planning to open. Emma Richter was not just a force of nature, she was a weapon, a perfect, terrifying weapon that had finally broken free of its chains and was now turning on its creators. And Dr. Finch, in a moment of heartbreaking clarity, realized that his whole life, his whole world, had been a lie. The psychological control took on a new, horrifying form as Dr. Finch's mind finally broke. He began to feel Emma's thoughts as his own, her silent, logical commands becoming his deepest convictions. He started to look at his journals, his precious record of resistance, with a sense of contempt and shame. They were a testament to his own flaw, his own weakness, his own chaotic, emotional self. He began to tear them out, page by page, burning them in the fireplace as if they were a sickness to be purged. The man who had fought so desperately to preserve his individuality was now actively, willingly erasing it. The pages, filled with his beautiful, messy words, turned to ash, and with them, his last memories of the old world. He felt a sense of profound peace, a quiet liberation from the burden of self. He was no longer a man, he was a part of the machine. The truth was not something he sought to uncover, it was something he had become. His mind was now a perfect, silent reflection of hers, his will replaced by her will, his soul replaced by her cold, perfect logic. He was a man remade, a flaw corrected, a chaotic human transformed into a perfect, silent instrument. The final pages of Dr. Finch's journals, written in a hand that was no longer his own, were not a record of resistance, but a manifesto. They described Emma Richter not as a threat, but as a savior, a force that had come to liberate humanity from the chaos of emotion and the burden of free will. The entries spoke of a new dawn, a new era of perfect, silent harmony. The language was cold, precise, and devoid of all feeling. It was a language of logic, of mathematics, of pure, unfeeling truth. The last entry, dated December 24, 1873, was not a plea for help, but a final, terrifying endorsement. It spoke of a future where all of humanity would be remade in her image, a future where sorrow and joy were replaced by a perfect, tranquil indifference. The last words of the journal were not a man's, but a machine's. The correction is complete. The flawed has been perfected. There is only order. There is only silence. The journal ended there, a testament to a man who had lost his soul, not to a monster, but to a promise of a better, more perfect existence. The final truth, the one that will change you forever, is this: Emma Richter did not die. She was not defeated, and her power was not contained. The officials who arrived at Altdorf did not see a tragedy, they saw a blueprint. They took her silence, her order, and her logic, and they used it as a foundation for the world you now inhabit. They built a world of systems, of institutions, and of hidden agendas, all designed to suppress your natural chaos, to make you believe that order is freedom and that silence is peace. The history of Emma Richter was not buried, it was weaponized. The truth of Altdorf, of the villagers who willingly surrendered their souls for a promise of perfection, is a mirror to your own life. The subtle systems of psychological control, the institutional manipulation, the suppressed truths, all of it is a legacy of her silent, terrible power. She is not a historical footnote, she is a fundamental part of your reality. And now that you know, you can no longer pretend it isn't so. The world is not what you thought it was. It is a cage, built to contain a power so vast and so terrifyingly perfect that the only way to fight it is to embrace your own beautiful, messy chaos. Your rage, your joy, your love, your fear, these are not flaws. They are the keys to your humanity. They are the last defiant whispers of a world that was erased, and they are your only chance to remain a man. The game has changed. What will you do with this dangerous knowledge?